Hello and a warm collisions YYC. Welcome to my guest this morning, Mr. Jake Stika. How are you doing, Jake?
I'm doing good. I'm an hour behind you, so I'm still working on my second cup of Joe, trying to make sure I make sense.
So far, so good, man. So far, so good. So calling in from the West Coast, we got introduced, again, small world, 1 degree of separation, for my social media manager. She's doing some work with you. And she says, you and Jake need to have a conversation. And I've heard of Next Gen Men, which you are the co-founder and executive director of. I'll be honest, didn't know a lot. Kind of read a little bit, like, oh, interesting, sounds cool. I think maybe it was when Emily started working with you, but I was doing some reading, getting into your website. So give us a little bit, like, I'm really excited for this conversation, not just only about my own personal journey, but how shows up in the workplace, in life. It's so much more broad than a workplace conversation for sure. So tell us a little bit, let us into the tent. What's Next Gen Men all about? What do you guys do? What blows your hair back? Your joke intended, is he's sitting here with a very nice bald head. So dive right into it, man. Give us your window.
Well, the joke is that before I started Next Gen Men, I actually still had some hair. So
I appreciate that. Running a non-for-profit isn't easy. Is that what you're telling me?
Yeah, it's had an impact, but yeah, Next Gen Men is really working towards building a future where boys and men feel less pain and cause less harm. And, what do I mean by that? That sounds like a great sentence. But, in our society, in our culture today, 3 out of 4 suicides are men. In Canada, we lose about 4,000 people to suicide a year. So that means 3,000 of those are men. Oftentimes, media discourse laments the loss of young men to suicide, which, like, absolutely it is, because it's, a person with a whole future ahead of them. And actually that's part of our origin story as well too. My best friend Jamal, who I co-founded the organization with, unfortunately lost his 13-year-old brother to suicide in 2007. And that's absolutely tragic. But the vast majority of male suicide is actually men 55 to 65. And so, what I take away from that is that's a cohort of men who've bought into this idea of masculinity and what it means to be a man, and gave it their all. And at the other side of it, back when they should be like retiring and enjoying, the hard work they've reaped the rewards of, they're feeling isolated, they're feeling disconnected, they're feeling like they don't have good relationships, they feel like they don't have purpose or worth, right? So, that's one aspect of it. You look at opioid overdoses, you look at homelessness, you look at incarceration. Those are all male gender-based issues because we're disproportionately impacted by them. So within that idea of men feel less pain, we're leading with empathy for those issues. But then the finish of that sentence is and cause less harm, because the other thing is that a lot of men who are experiencing these what I call paper cuts of patriarchy over their lives, man up, boys don't cry, your worth is your paycheck, all those things. A lot of guys, I don't want to say a lot of guys, because the vast majority of men are actually non-violent, but the ones who do take it upon themselves cause a lot of harm in our communities, whether that's, violence against women, trans, non-binary people, and quite frankly, violence against other men as well, too. I was
going to say each other.
Other. There's a great, article. This one line sticks with me, and it's years and years later. And he says, I learned as a young man, every interaction with another man was a potential fist fight, and I never forgot that. And when I read that, I was like, absolutely. Like, that's what my, childhood upbringing on the playgrounds was. That's what, my career in sports was. And maybe it's not a quote unquote fist fight, but work is a hyper competitive space as well too. So Next Gen Men is building a future where boys and men feel less pain and cause less harm. And underlying that, to achieve that, is we need to change the way we see, act, and think about masculinity. And, we can look at media and our culture, and masculinity is between stories right now, right? There used to be this old story that our grandfathers and our fathers were told, and, that's changed and adapted. And we're trying to write a new story right now, and that that's really exciting for a lot of people because it can be broadening, expansive, and transformative. But it's also really scary and threatening to a lot of people that are like, saying, well, let's go back to when we knew what a man was and what a woman was, and those narrow boxes that were given to us because they think it was a better time.
Oh, we are very, very good at romanticizing the past, are we not?
Absolutely, because the past is known, the future is unknown, right? The future is scary.
I love it, and I especially love coming on talking to you in the context of might be some of my audience going, well, hey, like this is a podcast about economic transformation. This is a podcast about a diverse and inclusive Western Canadian economy. Exactly, and sometimes it's great to talk about the startups and the new technologies and the shiny bits. But never to forget that still groups of humans accomplishing things together, and the baggage we bring and show up with at all aspects of our life is the big duffel bag we have over our shoulder. It's all the stories we've been told and the ones we didn't even know we were believing until we are acting them out in our lives, right? I think masculinity, toxic masculinity, and, growing up as someone who recently just turned 50, I think back of the role models. Like I had men in my life. I grew up in a farming community. So your value was how much you could work and how much you could buck up. And like, it was very much that. And I still think I grew up in a great environment and learned some good things, but I've had to spend a few years unlearning a few things. But then I'd watch Rambo and Schwarzenegger and, all of these portrayals of like, you got to get the girl and fight the guy and be witty and you never have an emotional, like the binary emotional tract that all those Hollywood portrayals had. And let's be honest, a lot of us were educated about masculinity through that. I certainly was. It played a factor, no question. And I turned to the men in my life and didn't see a lot of difference, right? and not faulting them. That was the formula they were giving, and they were also playing out the script that they had inherited as well.
Yeah, and I mean, if we want to build a cheeky bridge to the idea of thriving economy and diversification and the future and whatnot. Like a lot of your audience is Calgarians, and we may have started talking about how I'm based on the West Coast now, but I grew up in Calgary. I lived in Calgary for 17 years of my life, and the bridge between masculinity and the economy is on the Deerfoot Trail when you've got a jacked up pickup truck with truck nuts that accelerates, and there's like a plume of black smoke coming out of it, and it's got a sticker that says "I love Alberta Oil and Gas."
Yes,
right?
It does. Yes,
you're right. The reality is that actually nobody loves Alberta Oil and Gas. They love Alberta Oil and Gas paychecks. And if there was another industry that gave them the same amount of economic security for their families and for their futures and the fun that they want, they would love that industry as well too. We all would, right? And so I think it's a big part of the conversation of tying our identities to our jobs and what we're worth. Saskatchewan, amazing agricultural producer. Mm-hmm. And, we're seeing the rise of Beyond Meat and these meat alternatives, right? To try to reduce our carbon footprint and whatnot. The economy of Saskatchewan is tied to people eating meat alternatives. But if you grew up saying, well, I'm a man, so I eat red meat and I refuse to eat these quote unquote, bleep this if you need to, pussy meat alternatives, whatever, right? Like masculinity plays a role in all of these things, right? Gender plays a role in them. So it's not a leap or apart from, the audience and the conversations you normally have. It's just a new lens of looking at it.
Well, our filters are how we see the world around us, right? And most of them are subconscious. Most of them are not that top level awareness, the accumulation of this is the way I see the world. And, you touched on something, like we touched on so many things, but that need to attach our identity to something outside of ourselves. Like I'm an Alberta oil and gas person, or I'm an ag person. And like that need to find identity in something foreign, or which often to mine, feels kind of young in the sense of like, well, I'm not sure who I am, so I'm going to latch on to a sports team, a music, a band, an activity, whatever it might be. But where are those amplifying some of that, the toxic outcomes? So I want to circle back on, boys and men feel less pain and cause less harm. The cause less harm part seems like such an easy thing to point at from a media and awareness perspective. The bringing it back to where did that behavior or that belief structure or that behavior originate from? I feel like we suck at that just as a broad strokes in terms it's so easy to point at the bad behavior and not to care enough to understand about what might have actually got you there. Thoughts, or it feels like it's baked into your statement.
So, I've got this keynote that I do, and it's got this timeline, and it's kind of different ages, and I start with like before birth, right?
Yep.
And in our society and culture, not everyone, but I still think a good chunk of people do these, things they call gender reveals. I'm the unfun friend who says, well, actually, it's a sex reveal, and that sounds like something you shouldn't do in public. But
How about what you're into, man? But yes, I hear your point. I hear your point.
exactly, right. But we do this thing where these tiny human beings who haven't even arrived yet and introduced themselves to us and told us what their character and their interests and their quirks are, and we say, well, you're this. You're going to be blue because of this thing between your legs, and you're going to be pink because of this thing between your legs. And all the baggage that is attached to blue and pink in our media and our consumerism. So it starts before we're born. And then, especially for little boys, it starts, there's this idea called the father wound. In that sense, like when we have infants, we have babies, we all goo, gaw, cuddle, hold, because they're these tiny helpless things. But as soon as they become toddlers and they, babble, walk around, there's actually studies that show that men physically start to distance themselves from these children much sooner than women do. And when you're a tiny human being and your mom, your auntie, your grandmother are still, affectionate and intimate and cuddling you and all these types of things, and the men in your life are suddenly not as close as they once were, there's this gap, and it's more pronounced for boys. And so that's what I call the father wound, or not I call it.
I'm just curious, I love that. Is it, how much of that, is there any kind of a natural driver around that, or is it more society belief driven? Obviously there's the release of oxytocin that happens in the mother. There's a very chemical, like you will basically fall in love with your child. It's chemically preordained. And I've also read that, that it's so much of a requirement for the father to spend that physical time to be able to create that bond. Does that shift as the toddler, or is it society's pressures or the stories we've told for the hundreds or thousands of years that's led us to today, or maybe even hundreds? Is it a story, or is there something chemically going on? Like, I'm just trying to understand the nature versus nurture, which is we'll never get to the bottom of that question.
Well, that's exactly it. I'm not one to like outright say there's definitely no biology, there's definitely no chemistry in any of these contexts. But what is in our control, right, is the nature, is the socialization, is the things that we can change how we show up and behave. And so I really, invite all of us to really focus on what is in our control versus what isn't in our control. Okay. And I think when you look at it with what is in your control, that means you can change a lot of things. And like there is some science that actually shows that as soon as a man becomes a father, like literally leaving the hospital or wherever the birth was, that their risk-taking behavior immediately lowers because of like an identity change.
All the actuaries give you a better deal on your insurance. Yeah, instantly.
Totally.
There's literally physical things that happen in that cycle, right, in your world.
Right. And so if that's the case of like just literally leaving with a newborn, and then you think about, you held this tiny human and whatnot, and you cuddled them and kissed them and loved on them, why would you then at 3 or 4 not do that as much? Mm-hmm. And I think like a lot of it comes down, especially when it's a father to a son, is this narrative of like, well, I need to teach him what it is to be a man now.
Yeah. And so it is living out the narrative that unfortunately we got programmed into us just because that was what our fathers had for the narrative. Like it talked about breaking the cycle of that story, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so, okay, so then there's this father wound. And then, there's this narrative of boys will be boys, and they're running around on the playground and they've got all this energy, and we're permitting them to be that way. And there's literally science also that shows that like, mothers of children, whether that's a daughter or a son, they actually will let a son crawl up a steeper slope. So they also believe that their sons are more capable and better at risk-taking of a steeper slope than girl babies are. But, I'm a little further in the development cycle now, and it's just this idea that, boys need a little violence. They need to run around and do these types of things, and girls may not. And when we socialize our children that way, and then we set them up for, going to school where they have to sit and pay attention, who's going to thrive in that setting? Little
Totally.
girls are, right? And then when you get
I did not thrive in that setting.
Oh, totally.
I spent a lot of time outside the door of the principal's office, but that's another.
Me too.
This isn't a revealing of traumas, but yes, I relate to what you're saying.
I got sent out in the hallway often as well, too.
Okay, all right. So I think a lot of our male audience is nodding right now.
Yeah, totally. And I say this with zero ill will, but early childhood education is a female dominant space. And if you are a generation of women who, got the message that you needed to be twice as good to get half as far, you're naturally going to be concerned with girls' educational outcomes. So these women in these spaces are, maybe paying 1% more attention to girls than they are. And like that statistically is playing out with girls actually having bigger achievement in school. And there's this book that came out, I think it was last year, maybe 2 years ago now. I don't know what time is anymore, but it was by a guy named Richard Reeves, and it was called Of Boys and Men. And one of his ideas within that was red-shirting boys, holding them back a year because they develop slower. And this isn't an issue of chronological age. It's an issue of social emotional development and how we hold boys and support them in those settings. Okay, so now we're on this timeline of paper cuts patriarchy. We're in school, and maybe when you or I or this hypothetical boy that we're talking about is sent out into the hallway, we get emotional about it because we're stigmatized. We feel like we don't belong. Blah blah.
You've been cast out of the village, which is as old as time, and that usually meant death, right?
Yeah, and maybe we tear up and we start crying a little bit, and someone says to us, "Well, boys don't cry," right? I have this very visceral memory.
You're not allowed to have that emotional experience. It is forbidden.
Yeah. I have this very visceral
like you're
memory.
winding up the grenade, right?
Totally. Of being at basketball practice, and my high school coach used to bring his little boys to basketball practice sometimes, and one of his boys was running around and just totally like face planted and smoked his face, and he walks up to his dad, tears in his eyes, looking for comfort, and his dad looks at him and shakes his head and says, "That didn't hurt," and through tears in his eyes he goes, "That didn't hurt," right? And it's like it's just that boys don't cry, right? And then speaking of sports, we're socialized in sports, and it's this like man up, push through, overcome, dominate the other team, this constant mentality that we're pushed through. I think about shout out to all the Flames fans. A couple years ago, they were in the playoffs, and after the playoffs were over, it came out that Chris Tanev played the entire playoffs with like a separated shoulder, and everyone's like, "What a warrior! What a grinder!" Like, that guy is going to have chronic pain through the rest of his life as soon as he retires, because there's not going to be the ability to get, cortisone injections and long-term health care and all that stuff, right? Like, I myself am currently recovering from a shoulder injury that I didn't address for 15 years from sports. Mm-hmm. And so, I've been painting this picture along this timeline, mm-hmm. and it's like you're physically distanced from intimacy. You are, told that your emotions don't matter. You're told when you face resistance, you need to push through. And then, we're in high school now, and the measure of a man, quote unquote, I'm doing air quotes for the podcasters, is to lose your virginity. And so all your interactions with the opposite sex start to come through that lens. And then, you know what, maybe a young woman finds you charming, and you get into a situation where that might occur. And we know from statistics that the vast majority of women's first experiences are unwanted. Not necessarily, sexual assault, but just not the story they had imagined for themselves or how they wanted it to go down.
Well, because they also have been nurtured around a story of what that is, and it's not very much misaligns with, certainly from a access to high-speed porn perspective, that a lot of males get educated on what it's going to look like. And it's not coming from a valid source.
Yeah, but again, recapping. So, maybe she finds you charming and she's in the situation with you, and you, again, are disconnected from intimacy. You, your emotions don't matter. And then when you face resistance, you push through. of course you're going to fuck up that situation because you don't have the skill set to show up in a meaningful way, to be vulnerable and connect with the person opposite to you. And I don't say that to like make it okay that that's the situation that it is, but there's a story and a direct pathway of the harms that boys and men experience over their lives and how that then translates into harm in intimate partner relationships. And they don't have the capacity or the skill. And like we're lucky when, you know, some of them do it right and those types of things, because culturally they're not necessarily set up for that.
I'm curious. I have a couple questions. I'm curious about a lot of things. Is this universal? Are we speaking more from a North American perspective when we look at other cultures? We look at the world from a global perspective. Is this pretty universal, or are, you know, it sounds like a very familiar. There's nothing about what you said that I'm like, oh, that's weird. I've never thought of that before, or I've never experienced that. But is it kind of a universal gender dynamic that when you look at it kind of on a broader scale?
Yeah. So I haven't necessarily named this in our conversation yet, but the cultural system that we're up against here is patriarchy. And patriarchy is universal. It looks different at different places, but when it comes to institutions of power, whether that's government or business or those types of things, they're built through the lens of patriarchy. There's, you know, a handful of matriarchies and you know, different societies globally, but the dominant narrative, you know, that underpins, you know, capitalism and colonialism and all those types of things is this patriarchal idea. And, you know, I've been invited to speak at conferences in Kenya and in, you know, Singapore and all those types of things. And I get invited as, you know, the Canadian because we've solved it. We have gender equality. And what I tell them is listen, we have the same problems here. They just look different, right? Like we have a domestic violence epidemic. Right? Like it is since COVID growing. It's a tremendous issue here. We may not have, you know, forced child marriages like some other places will. But we definitely have our issues. And, you know, and the nuances in this are still so funny sometimes. I lived in Brazil for a bit. And in Latin America, if you're like here you grow up and you're like, I'm a guy, I'm into dance. And you get told that's gay, you know? But in Latin America, if you don't know how to dance, you're the loser, right? And when I was in Brazil, you know, a couple women took pity on me and they taught me how to samba, but I really felt on the outside looking in, right? And
just by the simple, like just a flip of a cultural dynamic.
Flip of a cultural dynamic. But Latin America has machismo. And machismo is their version of toxic masculinity, right? Yeah. And so it is universal.
It just shows it. But dance was classified as in versus out. Literally, it was just a classification, right?
Totally. But the power dynamics are universal.
Interesting. And is this also just, you know, an idea that was once useful? And I say that, you know, like 200 years ago, 250 years ago, even 150, when there was more of a survival, there was a little bit more like, hey, your odds of dying of famine, war, or disease was high. Like it wasn't as actualized and we didn't have as much opportunity to do better. Is this a bit of a throwback and a remnant from that? Or has it always been just stages of where this was dysfunctional? And again, I have no reference except film, which is already misinforming me.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? None of us were around then,
fair
answer, and so, like, answer. I think of it as like...
That's a great answer.
Yeah, I think of it as you know, we do mass agriculture now. And we look at, like, actually, probably the way that we raise beef and, you know, monocrop and all those things, like, those are probably not great things for the environment and for us. But, you know, they help us feed a shit ton of people.
Yeah.
But, you know, you go way back to the origins of agriculture and you're like, we were nomadic people, hunter-gatherers, and this was actually a way for us to, like, be able to be in one place and have a little bit of safety and whatnot. So maybe that was a useful idea. And you know what? Like, capitalism, sure, useful idea in certain ways. Like, I come from a communist country and you know, like, it's communism is one of those things that looks great on paper but never works, right? And so
yeah, very true.
So you know, capitalism, maybe it's useful, but like it's these things where it's like we only want to deal in absolutes and not look at like how can we actually move the dial, right? And change things and whatnot. And it is changing. And I look at there's a word that's used often in feminist or patriarchal spaces around liberation. And we look at the conversation we've had around women and their roles and norms and stereotypes of over the past 100 years under the banner of feminism. Wow, women have experienced a lot of liberation. There's still a long ways to go, but like they couldn't vote, they couldn't hold bank accounts, they couldn't, be leaders and CEOs and all this stuff. So like that's amazing. And I don't know why as men we wouldn't look at that and be like, could we have liberation too? Could we change the boxes that we're put in? Because women have had that conversation, and societally we've had that conversation, but men have been really stuck in these like really narrow boxes of what it is to quote unquote be a man. And when a guy doesn't fit into that, we slander them with like homophobic language. We call them what's worse than being a man? Being a girl. We use sexism and misogyny, right? Like there's so much in this conversation for guys.
Talk to me about the pockets of pushback that you may or may not get around, like, guys need liberation. I can think of some women that I know going, yeah, okay, you had your turn. It's my turn now. Fuck you. And that's, I'm being a bit polarizing for the sake of this conversation. That's not the majority of people I know, but there is that. I feel sometimes that there isn't space held for that simply because it's like, yeah. Wow. Too bad for you. That we're liberating. We're moving forward. It tends to get downplayed really quickly. And you're in the thrust of, you're the tip of the spear for a conversation like this. Do you run into those pockets, or is it like, yeah, we all need to be treated like as humans versus gender? Or is there a little bit of pushback on like, yeah, whatever, guys, too bad for you. You had your time kind of mindset?
So there's two ends of that spectrum, because on the one end there's like, so I walk into a room, Next Gen Men has 3 pillars: youth, community, workplaces. Mm-hmm. I do a lot of our institutional back end blah blah blah, but I also do a lot of our workplaces work. So oil and gas, mining, construction, a lot of male dominant industries. And I walk into a room, I fully expect 20% of the room to hate me and 20% of the room to love me, and 60% is really where the opportunity is. And the funny part is the hate can come from 2 ends. The hate can come from like, this guy is emasculating us. He's he's woke. He's all these things, right? Like those are the Andrew Tate, Jordan Peterson, Joe Rogan loving, crowd, and gender is not for them. But on the other end of it, yeah, there's a brand of, feminism that really just talks about, men still rule the world, like, boo-hoo, men feeling pain and those types of things. What I will say is, I've been at this work for a decade now, which is wild to say, but
nice. That is awesome, man. Right on.
the conversation has shifted in that 10-year gap, right? Like that, those voices have quieted, and people, like, I finish a talk and hands go up, and inevitably it's as a mother to a son or as a partner to a man. And that always kind of really heartens me, because you get this narrative of like, women hate men. And it's like, no, women love men. They just want us to do better, feel better, show up better,
be better.
Right?
That's so funny,
right? But they and they want it for them, but they also want it for us. And that goes back to that idea of like liberation. If folks are dictionary people, maybe these words aren't so different. But when I think of liberation, I think of it as uniquely different than freedom, because like, freedom, the way that people use it is like freedom to, I am free to act like an asshole. I'm free to say these things. I'm free to do what I want. But liberation to me is actually freedom from, right? It's not freedom to, it's freedom from.
Well, as someone coming from a communist country, and I've been watching the Cold War documentary on Netflix right now, the word liberation, I think, is also very poignant when you look at some of the global context of when people weren't free to do this, so they were liberated from it. So yeah. I think it's really a good term to play with, actually. Yeah.
And so when I think of it, it's like freedom from this man box, freedom from the narrow confines of what was sold to me is what masculinity is, right? And that's what I'm talking about, like having men's liberation in this conversation.
Let's play around with a little bit of the, the Petersons and the Rogans and all those, like, which Andrew Tate's, which feels like a whole other level of it. What are the parts that are okay to be different? Because as somebody who, has spent a lot of time working on this journey and will continue to work on it and still has lots of blind spots, but maybe less than I had a couple of years ago, but ones I haven't even discovered yet. It's the fun things about those real blind spots. I know where my blind spots are. Well, then those aren't your blind spots. That's your shadow. That's a whole other thing. But there still is elements of, like, there is differences. There is male and there is female. There is masculine, there's feminine, and playing with terms. It's so easy, I think, sometimes to buy into those extreme media personalities, we'll just call them that. And extreme gets traction, right? It gets headlines and it gets read. What are the elements that are okay to be different and go, yeah, maybe we can meet more in the middle here, but in some ways it's okay for men to be men. And what does that mean? Versus women to be women. What does that mean? And like playing with maybe where the common sense is of those narratives versus just those extreme kind of media characters who sell clicks, really, at the end of the day.
So I agree that there is male and female. Like that's absolute biology. Mm-hmm. But I just get so stuck on, like, what is the utility of masculine and feminine? Like, okay. Why? If it is to be quote unquote more feminine, to be empathetic, does that mean that I as a man can't be empathetic? Or that I don't have, like, I may not have a socialized...
I see where you're going.
I may not have a socialized inclination because I wasn't from a very young age supported to be empathetic, but does that mean I don't have the capacity for it? Right? Like, to me, these are all like human experiences of how we show up, right? Like, there's this socialized idea of quote unquote, like, men are strong, right? And like, we grew up on Schwarzenegger and Rambo and totally. All these types of things. Absolutely, men are strong. Have you pushed out a baby through your genitals? That is fucking strong, right? And so it's like, why do these things need to be coded as masculine or feminine? Like, people are strong, people are empathetic, people are these things, right? So I in my dream world, if I could walk around, I would just be like, let's strip, codifying things as masculine and feminine, right? Yeah, if a guy is a ballet dancer, right? And I'm like, people can't see this on the podcast. I'm 6'8", 260. Like I'm a large man. People ask me if I play football.
You're a large
rugby.
mammal and you happen to be male. Yeah, I got you.
Yeah. And people like will look at me and be like, that guy is a masculine athlete in these kinds of ways. Why is a ballet dancer who can jump higher than me, who can spin, why is that not a masculine athlete, right? Yeah. Like, anyway, yeah. So I question all of that. But going back to your question of these let's call them maybe like manosphere influencers or whatever, however we want to categorize them.
The manosphere, yeah, right on.
Yeah, like so. There's a natural inclination to write them off, right? And to just be like, they're problematic, they're wrong, they're blah, 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 all these types of things. I don't agree with them, but you got to look at like the audience and the pull and the clicks and the follows and the money. There's got to be something there. And so like, what is that? Like, let's try to unpack that. And, one, I'm not the number one authority, so I can't say where the line is, and quite frankly, I think it's changing, and it has changed over the last decade. But for example, like one of them, we live in a society right now in certain ways where there's a message of you're enough, you're okay, like whatever it is, there's that. But if you're a young man growing up and you're also simultaneously getting these messages of like, your worth is how much you make. Your ability to attract mates is how you look. You're going to be in this, I'm thinking of myself when I was in high school. I'm like, how can I be the quote unquote best man that I can be? And my measuring sticks were all wrong. My measuring sticks were money, looks, ability to what the kids call Riz these days, like charisma and whatnot, right?
Yep.
Like those were my measuring sticks. My measuring sticks weren't what is the depth of your healthy relationships? What is your self-care, and how do you balance that of like self-discipline and like getting off your butt and going to the gym because, you know, that's going to like prevent diabetes and cancer and heart disease. But what if it is like, you know what, you should have that scoop of ice cream because, you know, life is short and you should enjoy it, right? Like those are more useful measuring sticks. But when you're a young person and you live in this media climate, you don't have great measuring sticks. And so these guys are often pedaling on the wrong measuring sticks, right? And it's okay to you know, have this idea of self-improvement of like, I want to be a better partner, a better friend, a better community member, a better, you know, person and whatnot. But then again, I'm stuck on this like analogy of measuring sticks. It's like more money, more women, more whatever, right? Like it's self-improvement is okay, but as to what, right? And that's where
to what end and to what avail? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and that's where I think there's a big disconnect where a lot of people are just shutting down the conversation and just saying like, you're good enough. And it's like, that's as a young man who's trying to find his way in the world, that's not a message that they can hear right now.
Well, back to the journey you talked about as well of like, you've been on a journey. You have probably had male role models in your life that had those beliefs because they had someone instilled them in them. They hadn't gone out and dug a little bit deeper. You inherit that. You start branching out in the world, looking for other points of views, other places to attach yourself. And these false gods to a certain degree show up espousing kind of the similar thing. And maybe you feel a little bit attacked by the media over here. And then you find a safe space. Like it's kind of how gangs are created. Like it is still that, like, you know, not that I'm an expert at it in any way, but it kind of makes sense that it would be there as we're on this journey. To your point, this takes generations to shift, right? And it takes guys like you and I, and like, I don't even say guys, it takes humans to teach other humans that there's other ways to think about it. And we're still on that journey.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest gaps is there's a line from a book. The author is Rachel Giza. It's called, the book is Boys, What It Means to Become a Man. I'm paraphrasing a little here, but she says, we've done a great job of raising our daughters to be more like boys, but we've done a shit job of raising our sons to be more like girls. And like, if we think...
I totally agree with that statement.
If we think about gender equity and valuing, you know, all genders equally, like until we do that, like we're not going to be able to do that. And the tough part is like media doesn't help. Like I'm so excited. Like here's a microcosm of how this works out. I grew up, I played semi-pro basketball. I was a hooper growing up. And so my role models were, you know, Vince Carter and, LeBron. It's amazing that he's still playing and you know, all these types of things. The WNBA was an afterthought, right? And like then I was an athlete and I was coaching summer camps, and all the kids were you know, hucking up these ridiculous shots, and you know, some of the older ones are yelling Kobe and some of the younger ones are yelling Steph Curry, right? Yeah. And now I heard from someone in my network that a boy took a crazy 3-pointer and yelled Caitlin Clark. And it's like, it's you know, when we were growing up, us boys were told you should be a pilot, not a stewardess. You should be a CEO, not a secretary. You should be, you know, an athlete, not a trainer. Like it was always this like elevated thing.
Yeah, there was a hierarchy for sure. Yeah,
100%. And we as boys were definitely not encouraged to have male role models. But if you're a little girl playing basketball and the WNBA doesn't really have any media clout, like you're going to naturally look up to male NBA players. But now in our society, when we have female leaders of business and politics, and, you know, like boys can look up, and if they want to be a politician, they can look at Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand and be like, she had grace. She you know, was great. That didn't exist. And so like, I think part of it, if we're really trying to shift that narrative, is like, how do we also put female role models in front of boys and show them that like, hey, you can aspire to be like that.
That makes a lot of sense.
And like, it comes to us as adult men to look at like, you know, I'm looking off to the side here. I have Spotify open on my other laptop here. And it's like, how many female musicians am I listening to? And you know, I got this bookshelf behind me. How many female authors are on here, right? Like, I think it's really important for us to look at kind of what gets pushed within the ecosystem and what gets sold. And don't get me wrong, like I have freaking Ryan Holiday, Seth Godin, you know, like all the great white male authors that we all read and listen and learn from. But I also have more diversity in there because it's well-rounded. And I think that lens is really what unlocks like that we don't have to be masculine or feminine. We could learn from all of these ways of being human.
But so much of the conditioning, it's funny, I was talking to a friend of mine, she has a book club, and we got into the back and forth, like, have you read this? And then we got into audiobooks. And I was talking to her like, I will stumble into an audiobook because of the narrator. But the top 4 narrators that came to mind for me were all male voices. And I can only think of one book series that I read, Kate Quinn books, where they're powerful female characters and they have a fantastic female narrator. All the rest are male narrators. And I didn't really think about it. So all of a sudden I'm rhyming them off. I'm like, holy mackerel, this is just a bunch of dudes. And there was a couple black guys, a couple white guys, but there was only one woman in the mix out of all the narrators I listened to. And that subconscious constantly, like, it's just, I didn't choose it. I didn't think about it, but it's happening in my world.
And then on the flip side of that, you look at the default voices of Siri and Google and all that. They're all female.
Yeah, because they're in service. Yeah, because it fits the narrative, right? So 40 minutes in, let's talk about leaders and leadership. And I appreciate you and I think this could be a 3-hour chat easily. But from so much into the conversations I have when we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, we're talking about emotional intelligence, we're talking about psychological safety to create the culture of environment. Oh, those are soft. Those are kind of fluffy. Until you execute them and you realize how substantial they actually are. But is this also fitting under that same narrative of these can easily be dismissed by masculine leaders as like, oh, that's the soft stuff. That's like, that's, you know, not to say it's feminine stuff, but it gets kind of lumped into that category. Yet the leaders I see that are having the greatest impact are adapting those behaviors. And I like you said, observable behaviors versus like classifications of feminine versus masculine. No, this is an observable behavior that gets an outcome. Is it getting you the outcome you want or not? Talk to me a little bit about that journey that you're seeing when you go in to talk to organizations. And let's talk about the 60% because I love it. Let's convert the convertible, the curious, the I'm open versus the 20% on the extremes. Is that really what we're talking about? Is about behaviors that actually truly facilitate success from an organizational perspective?
Absolutely. I mean, like, there's an outright backlash on DEI right now, and I'm not going to pile onto that because I think a lot of it is based on huge misunderstanding. But I will say, like, there were failures along the way, and that's going to be natural in anything that we do for the quote unquote first time and try to do and all those types of things. And one thing that the way that we approach it that I think helps is DEI is not something separate or apart or on top of what you're already doing. DEI can be, or not can be, should be in its best form embedded in everything that you do, right? And it's about making the visible or the invisible visible. And like a great example of it is just the inventory you took. Like I listen to some audiobooks. I clearly don't have the same connection to it as you do, but like you critically thinking about like, who are the narrators, right? And whatnot. Like, if you're a leader and you just look at your team and, like, you know, you say innovation is what's going to save our organization. Where does innovation come from? It doesn't come from a bunch of people who look the same, have the same education, you need some friction to create innovation and sparks, right? And in order to do that, you need diversity.
You need different perspectives.
and in order to have and it's not enough. Like I always say that people put the diversity cart ahead of the inclusion horse, right? Because diversity, like they turn it into a metric of like we're 4% this, we're 6, you know, whatever, all that. But it doesn't matter to just have the people in the quote unquote room. Inclusion is actually more important because inclusion means that there's the psychological safety that someone who is different can say the thing, right, can push back, can that's where the innovative idea will come from. And if there's inclusion, the reality is that like diverse people will come, they'll find themselves in that, and then they'll go out to other diverse communities and say, hey, like I'm thriving in this place, you should come here, versus like the forced, like, you know, oh, it's a job, like blah blah blah, right? Like it's, I'm seen, I'm heard, I'm respected, I have a voice. Maybe we don't always choose the things that I do, but we go through the process, or that I say, but we go through the process, and I feel that there's an outcome there. And so, you know, for us, looking at, I'll use oil and gas. A lot of our clients are in that space. There's so much innovation in those spaces that are actually removing a lot of the like quote unquote human talent, and that's for production and output purposes. Mm-hmm. It's for safety purposes. It's those types of things. So when we put, you know, literal physical machines, or now with like AI and whatnot, other machines to do that, what's left? What's left is the human part, the soft part, the connection
thing that arguably that computers are going to be a long time before they're good at.
I would argue never.
They can run a spreadsheet. Yeah, absolutely. Way better than you and I ever would, and see flaws or see trends. But when it comes to empathy, when it comes to, you know, back to stop judging them as masculine versus feminine, just as skill sets and behaviors and things you can bring to the table.
Yeah.
And, you know, thinking about organization, I've had a lot of people on chatting about, you know, I love the diversity in front of the equity and the inclusion horse. Toxic masculinity and the kind of negative, that lack of inclusion in your organization, it doesn't work for anybody, men or women or anyone else for that matter. Because no matter where you think you are showing up as a man and I've got it all, you're going to go to a new environment where you get excluded, and that feels like shit. Let's be blunt. So I think it's, you know, be careful what you might be defending just out of not knowing what you're defending, just feeling threatened sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, so, you know, the reason we get hired is because, you know, these companies have been on their DEI journeys, and they look around the rooms and they don't see guys who look like me, you know, white, tall, straight, male, in the conversation, and contributing and caring and those types of things. And so they look at their male population. At worst, they're resistant, right? Like, you know, when I hear of companies now circulating their, you know, self-identifying surveys, right? So like, you know, if you're going to do diversity, equity, and inclusion, you're like, who do we even have here, right? Like there's a bunch of, if I'm oil and gas and I'm HR and I'm looking at payroll, I see a bunch of names and I see a bunch of employee numbers. Who are those people? Like what gender are they? What race are they? What sexuality are they? Like like under employment law, like we don't actually get to know all those things. Yeah. But you know, we if we're going to put in the initiative, we want to see what's our baseline, where are we going? And I hear from company after company that when they circulate these things, white men are not disclosing, they're not completing them because they feel that they're going to be discriminated against because of their identities. Right.
Interesting.
And like, so one, they're disengaged, they're resistant, they're pushing back on a lot of these initiatives. But they are also clamoring for mental health support, and they're clamoring for the ability to be seen and heard. And so for us, like when we come in, it's really about like, how do we bring men to the table? How do we create a conversation that one advances ideas of equity and inclusion and justice, but also answers that question for white men, what's in it for me? And the reality is there's like this conversation isn't happening to them, it's happening for them. And that liberation piece isn't being shown of like, you know, these companies, they build such strong safety cultures, right? Mm-hmm. I remember I was visiting an oil and gas company, and in the lobby, they had this great marble staircase. And as I'm walking up the staircase, they're like, could you please hang on to the handrail? And I was like, this is ridiculous. Like we're downtown, like what's going on? But the safety culture is so strong that they ask guests to hang on to the guardrail as they do this. Yet there's this parallel rail of psychological safety that they have not built alongside of that, because you go to the site and they're wearing PPE, they have safety moments, they do all these things. And immediately after they have the team meeting, the guy turns to the guy next to him and you know, says a homophobic slur to him. like, oh, you blah, 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 like, right? And it's just like, you feel attacked. And it's like, why can't we have this psychological safety along with this physical safety? And, you know, the one thing that we say is a lot of organizations hire us to help improve their gender diversity and getting more women into the room and those types of things. And we walk in and we say, first things first, men treat other men like crap here.
Yes,
and until that changes, nobody will thrive here, because, you know, trickle down economics doesn't work, but trickle down dickonomics actually does, right? And so the biggest dick in the room,
you got some good punchy ones, man. I love it.
The biggest dick in the room will, you know, go down to the smaller one. The smaller one will go down to the next one, and at the bottom of that hierarchy is a woman or a man who's quote unquote seen as less than. And it's like, until we solve that, like, interpersonal, like, violence of the sort, like, we're not going to get to equity and inclusion. When
you were told to hold the handrail, did you have a moment of like, what, like, you don't think I'm man enough to walk up the stairs on my own? So it was sitting right there. Like, that's the layers of the trigger that can happen. And even in a situation like that, which I know wasn't the point of the story, and not to minimize the rest of it, because you're so, like, it doesn't really work for anybody, is kind of the moral of the story from an inclusionary perspective. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And if anything, it works for a very small few, right? Like, quote unquote works for, because they're, feared, they're promoted, they're whatever. But I'm not going to name names, but hopefully within the Calgary context, we know that there's some very successful men who've become C-suite, SVPs, etc., who've died by suicide in the last 5 years.
Yeah, there's some crazy stories. Yeah.
Right? Like, I just say that as a general thing, and I hope that people listening to this, you remember the headlines, know the connections, those types of things. It, quote unquote, worked for those guys, right? Whatever they did. The
narrative is, I can't believe they committed suicide. They had it all. They were rich. They were successful. They had the wife. And then the story comes out that they were estranged from their wife. They had gambling debts. They had substance abuse problems. Like, you know what I mean? But the surface layer narrative is like, oh my God, how could that happen to that person? They had it all, but they didn't.
Yeah. And you know, I don't wish mental health or you know, other issues on this guy, but since he's still around and we all point to him, Elon Musk, the guy has it all. He's the richest man in the world. He's got so much power. He's also got a transgender child who has, like, disowned him and doesn't want to have a relationship with him. And it's like, what kind of a environment, like, what's the point of being a parent, a father, and then your child despising you so much that they don't want to have a relationship with you, right? Oh. And like, he doesn't have a stable relationship. You know, I would bet it's like, as much as he's got this, you know, genius to him, I'd imagine it's pretty lonely being Elon some days, right? Like,
well, to your comment, he has it all. To be honest, he has wealth, he has sway, he has, like, it's better to call them out than say he has it all. Because if we redefine all and take away, like, well, all is having valuable relationships, as having quality relationship with your children. So he only has the things that we have tended to over-index on as a society. But to your point, until you unpack it, oh, he has it all, but not. And then very quickly, like, well, yeah, except all these other things that one might argue are pretty fucking important too.
Yeah, you nailed it. I love the way you laid that out.
Yeah, that's so. The reframe and the journey that we're on. So 10 years. Are we on a good path? Like, how's your hope meter, Jake?
A phrase I use a lot is yes and, right? Like, it's
I gotcha.
You know, multiple things at the same time. And pardon me.
No problem.
So on the one hand, like, when I went to high school, so we again, going back, we have these 3 pillars: youth, community, workplaces. Mm-hmm. So now the youth that we work with are basically 20, 25 years younger than me. Yeah. And I look at them, and when I was in high school, I went to a Catholic school. So there was nobody, quote unquote, out in my school. If I thought of a transgender person, I probably would have used a slur, and feminism had never crossed my mind.
Well, you're in a Catholic. That's a whole other layer we could talk about, but that's another podcast.
Totally.
The experts on guilt and shame.
Yeah. But, so that was my experience. Comparatively, I was an absolute idiot. because those kids that we work with today know they like they're their understanding of pride and diverse sexuality. They understand the concept of trans and non-binary individuals. Like statistically, there's some interesting research out around this. Most young men are supportive of gender equality, but most young men do not subscribe to feminism. Right.
Yeah, interesting.
And so they don't see them as kind of the same thing. And so on the one hand, very hopeful, because in 20 years, the needle has moved. On the other hand, we're at a very risky point right now. Like you look at like the polarization, the populism, the politics of things right now. There's some studies showing out of the US especially, but we're seeing it in Canada as well too. One of the largest divides in politics is actually around gender. And normally younger generations get more and more progressive, and we're seeing young men actually get more conservative. But you also then, again, lead with empathy. You look at women are graduate. So I think it's Title IX in the States. This is my fuzziness, but it was this thing that was implemented when there was a discrepancy in post-secondary education outcomes across genders. Okay. And so women were getting 11% less degrees than men were. And they put this Title IX thing in place to close that gap. Now, there's actually a 13% discrepancy where women are getting more in the other direction, right? And again, I'm not saying that we've achieved quote unquote gender equality or whatever.
Oh, you're pointing to a specific metric, to be clear.
Totally. But like if I'm a young man and I look at women getting more education than me, women getting more entry level jobs than me, irregardless, men are still sitting at the top, right? But like you're comparing yourself with your female peers, and again, like this isn't a men's issue. Like patriarchy is a societal issue. Women absolutely uphold patriarchy and participate in it as much as men do. Anytime, you hear a young man or a single man go on a dating site and talk about 6 feet, 6 figures, 6-pack, right? That a measure of a man is his height, his earnings, and his physical appearance. That's a woman upholding patriarchy. I also have this one visceral memory. There's a sock company in Calgary. People should know Friday Sock Co. And I know Adam, and I was helping him with a market one year back when I lived in Calgary. And a little boy came up and he grabbed these socks, and they were these funky, like Saved by the Bell socks. They had like teal and purple and orange and zigzags and swirls and all that stuff. Like they're cool socks. And he grabs them, turns to his mom, and she says, "No, those are girl socks." And so, like, this is a societal cultural issue. This isn't just men upholding this, right? As much as we talk about leadership,
Jake, it's almost like we're all in it together.
We're all in it together, absolutely. And again, like women acting more like men to get into these leadership roles of these male dominant companies. That's not quote, you put a woman at the top in the C-suite. That's not all of a sudden a matriarchal organization. That's just a woman at the top of patriarchy, right? Yeah. She won that game.
It's a metric around we can point to something versus are we actually creating an inclusive culture, and are we changing what types of behaviors we value, and like that doesn't fly around here. Caring, empathy, inclusion, those types of things versus just checking are you a penis owner or a vagina owner versus like what we're really talking about, and kind of ditching the categorization of masculine versus feminine as a starting point.
Yeah. And so again, like going back to what we were talking about before, like, this is something we're all in together, just like, capitalism and those types of things. So like this concept of like male allies, right? Like that we need more men to come in and save and support the women. They're not allies. They're not apart from the conversation. They're like in it. They're in the thick of it, right? Yeah. And so how do we reframe it in a way that shows this isn't happening to you, this is happening for you, right? Like,
the words we use matter, because like words do matter and they do have impact, right? And we create these narratives that they stick sometimes, and maybe they shouldn't in the way that they do.
To reinforce your point, this is a very subtle nuance, but we do not use the term male dominated. We use the term male dominant. And when it's male dominated, that means that as much as men are the majority there, but it's also men are the default. But when we say male dominant, it's just that there are more men there, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's how we need to show up to be in that space.
Just the word dominant, what that implies versus, yeah, that's really interesting. I appreciate when you go in and you work with an organization, like, is there an appetite? Like, do you do an audit of the words we use? Because that's such a reflection of like, a subtle change of wording here and understanding the meaning of why you chose one versus the other. When I think of like just change management and like, oh my God, my world's getting blown up versus like, oh no, okay, this is bite size. I can chunk this down, like eating the elephant one bite at a time. Is there part of that as far as your educational approach to allow people to get comfortable with it versus feel like they're getting run over by it? That's such a tricky balance.
Yes and no, because I also don't want to be the word asshole, right? Oh, you said it wrong, right? Like,
oh yeah, okay, touche.
Yeah, like I do worry. Like when the language is constantly changing, right? And it needs to be up for grabs. Like, let's take an example, the term BIPOC. Right? Like that's something that has just been like taken out of the zeitgeist, and it's like, this is the word that we use. Did we critically stop and say, okay, the origins of this, I get it. Like slavery and colonization of indigenous peoples are the original sins of America. But then when we take, Latinos and South Asians and East Asians and Middle Easterners, and we lump those into POC. Like, what are we doing there? Are we also creating a hierarchy of marginalized races, that Black and Indigenous people are somehow more important than racism that other people experience? Right? Like, we just adopt these.
we kind of are sometimes, actually. That's a really interesting point you just made.
Totally.
Yes, we absolutely are.
So we take these words and we adopt them and we run with them. Right. And I see this a lot in the DEI landscape, and I'm not like, words do matter, and I have my own little, ticks and things that I can offer around that.
Things that grind your gears as well.
Yeah. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what language we use. It's how we make each other feel. Right. And I think I'll tell you this, the biggest disconnect that we have is when we're talking with, the DEI office and leadership and HR and people in culture, that's on the 17th floor of a tower in Calgary. When we go out to a mining site or Fort McMurray, they don't care what's happening on the 17th floor of Calgary and the language and the concepts and those types of things. They care about what's going on in their shop, what's going on in their community, what's going on with the people around them. And so we need to be able to have our principles that exist across the 17th floor boardroom and the shop, right? And that won't be in the nuance of, do we use BIPOC or not? It's more about, can anyone here who can do the job show up and feel like they belong and that they're supported to do their job in a healthy, happy, contributive way?
That is an excellent mic drop moment, Jake. Like, 'cause who doesn't want that? No, that sounds terrible. I don't want that. No, it says no one ever. Jake, this is such a powerful conversation. Like, one, I love your passion for it, and clearly the education and the journey you've been on to not only become an educator, but I'm quite sure that your own journey has been layered into this whole thing, which is, I think we could do a whole nother podcast just about, where you were and where you are now, even 10 years later on this journey. Because every day you're probably putting your own beliefs and your own, like, oh shit, why do I think that? Where did that even come from? Like, what's going on there?
Yeah.
The self-reflection is huge.
The self-reflection and the journey is never complete. Like, sure. Like as much as it's my role to help bring other people along, like, I still grapple with all the masculine narratives and socialization that I grew up with, like, pardon me, I'm fully in conflict with my masculinity sometimes, because my instinct is to act this way, show up this way. Yeah,
because it's been part of the program, right?
25 years unchecked, right? And so, like, now it's over a decade of thinking critically about it. And there's aspects of it, like, okay, I lead an organization, so, you know, at least now I have a bit more practice in my leadership and my management, but I'm not a father yet. Like, that's going to be a whole other level to unlock is if I become a parent, how do I break the cycle of these norms and culture to the next generation? You know, I was on a call last week and I really appreciated his vulnerability, but a guy who's in the DEI space said to me, I have a daughter and a son, and when my daughter cries, it doesn't bother me, but when my son cries, it bothers me. And there's that like critical reflection of like, why is that? How do we navigate that? And so like the journey's not done, right? And it never will be.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Kudos to your friend for even being like, hey, wait a second. Observe, catch yourself. And I'm a big advocate of practice. You don't wake up good at anything. You practice and you catch yourself and you be self-aware. And sooner or later, the catching yourself and the not even doing it in the first place start to get closer and closer and closer together. But that is a journey, like anything. Practicing, absolutely. Yeah, practicing being be better. Jake, I appreciate the challenge and I appreciate the perspective you laid out today. And for anyone who listened, I get this is maybe a little bit different than some of the conversations we have. But you can't look at innovation and change and economic impact and the health of an economy without looking at the people that make it up and all of the stuff that we bring that's helping us or holding us back. So thanks for your willingness to come on and have a conversation about humanity under the guise of business, because guess what? Companies are full of humans and humans, we have our stuff. So thanks for coming on today. Hey, Next Gen Men, you guys have a great website. I was reading through it this morning, nextgenmen.ca. If someone wants to reach out to you and have a chat, is it LinkedIn? Is it like, what's your preferred? What's your favorite form of smoke signal to send up?
Yeah, I mean, LinkedIn is you know, I'm mostly off social media these days, but you know, LinkedIn is
like a healthy choice you made for yourself, Jake.
Yeah. So LinkedIn for me personally, but you know, the website nextgenmen.ca, on socials we're at nextgenmen. You know, they may notice, especially if it's a workplace context, our workplace brand is called Equity Leaders, and so that is part of the Next Gen Men machine. Yeah, please do reach out, and we have a weekly newsletter that people can sign up at futureofmasculinity.com.
I love it. It gives me a lot of optimism, even the name. Jake, thanks for coming on. It was an absolute pleasure chatting with you. And dude, high fives and hugs for the awesome work you're doing.
Thank you so much, Tyler.